The air on the desert range shimmered with heat, rising in waves off the cracked ground, the sun beating down as if determined to bake the life out of everything that dared remain still. The U.S. Navy SEALs had come here for training, their rifles glinting under the merciless sky, their boots grinding into the sand with every step. It was supposed to be another day of disciplined drills, and the kind of training that sharpened men into weapons. That was until she arrived. She wasn't a soldier, not a recruit, not even someone who belonged within the wire fences of the base. She was a local woman, a civilian who had stumbled upon the gathering with the quiet composure of someone who had spent her whole life blending into the background. Dressed in simple clothes, with a headscarf that shielded her face from the sun, she looked so unassuming that most of the men barely glanced her way, at first. But then one of the SEALs, tall and broad-shouldered, the type who carried arrogance in his voice like a badge, decided to make her the butt of a joke. "Why don't we let the lady try?" he said, waving toward the rifle as though it were some carnival game. His tone was mocking, his grin sharp. The others laughed because that's what soldiers do when the moment calls for easy amusement, the kind that makes the hours pass faster. None of them expected anything more than a clumsy attempt, maybe the rifle slipping from her hands, maybe the recoil making her stumble backward. It would be entertainment, a story to tell later. She didn't speak when they gestured her forward. She didn't defend herself or laugh along. She simply walked with quiet, deliberate steps, her eyes fixed on the long black instrument of war lying on the shooting bench. When she reached it, she ran her hand along the cold metal, her touch not clumsy at all but precise, familiar even. The men noticed, though they didn't say anything. She adjusted the rifle slightly, checking the bipod, shifting its weight until it sat perfectly aligned. Someone muttered under his breath, something about her acting like she knew what she was doing, and another chuckled in agreement. But the officer leading the training, a commander with a hardened face and a voice that cut like gravel, leaned back with his arms crossed, watching. He wasn't laughing. He had been around long enough to know that sometimes the quietest ones carried the most unexpected weight. The target they had set for practice that day wasn't the usual 800 meters most trainees struggled with. The officer, perhaps to impress his men, had ordered the steel plate dragged out to 2,950 meters, nearly 3 kilometers away. It was a distance even seasoned snipers found daunting, a shot that demanded mastery over not just the rifle but the air itself, calculating wind drift, humidity, the Earth's curvature, the Coriolis effect. Most of the men had taken turns missing, bullets kicking up dust around the target, sometimes close, sometimes hopelessly wide. The officer had scoffed at their failures, his voice cutting into them like a drill sergeant's lash. "No one here is hitting that today," he had said earlier. And now this woman, this nobody, had been handed the rifle as a joke, as if to underline the impossibility of the task. She lowered herself onto the mat, the fabric of her clothes gathering at her elbows as she steadied her body behind the weapon. Her breathing slowed, each inhale and exhale syncing with the rhythm of her heartbeat. The chatter of the men around her faded into a distant hum, irrelevant noise compared to the stillness she summoned inside herself. She adjusted the scope, not hurriedly but with a patience that seemed alien in this place of constant movement and urgency. The officer watched her movements with narrowing eyes. The way she angled her cheek against the stock, the way she closed one eye and let the other settle behind the glass, it wasn't the fumbling of someone new. It was deliberate, disciplined. The SEAL who had handed her the rifle snickered again, breaking the silence. "What's she doing, writing poetry?" he muttered. A couple of the younger men laughed, but their voices carried less conviction now. Something in the way she moved made the mockery feel brittle, as though they were laughing to cover unease. She didn't flinch at the comments. Her finger rested lightly along the trigger guard, not yet inside, waiting, calculating. The wind brushed against her cheek and she seemed to feel it, tilting her head slightly, as though reading something invisible written in the currents of air. Her eyes narrowed through the scope. 2,950 meters away, the steel plate shimmered in the haze, barely more than a mirage to the naked eye. Then came the moment. She shifted her breathing, held it, and her finger eased onto the trigger. It wasn't a jerk or a nervous pull. It was the kind of touch that came from familiarity, from trust between shooter and weapon. The crack of the rifle shattered the silence, echoing across the barren range, a thunderclap against the empty desert. The recoil pressed into her shoulder, but her body absorbed it without struggle, her focus unbroken. All eyes followed the invisible path of the bullet as it tore across nearly 3 kilometers of open space, vanishing into the shimmer of heat. For a second there was nothing, only the ringing echo of the shot fading into silence. And then, faint and unmistakable, came the sharp ping of bullet against steel. The laughter died instantly. The men froze, their grins evaporating, their eyes snapping toward the target in disbelief. Someone swore under his breath, unable to contain it. Another rubbed his eyes as though they had betrayed him. The officer's arms dropped from his chest, his jaw tightening as he stared at the distant plate. The sound had been clear, too clear to mistake. She had hit it. At nearly 3 kilometers with her very first shot. The desert air seemed to hold its breath, the heat shimmering not just from the ground now but from the stunned silence of every man standing there. She didn't look at them when she eased the bolt back, the metallic click-clack a casual punctuation to her feet. She chambered another round without hesitation, as though this wasn't extraordinary, as though this wasn't something to make hardened soldiers gape. Again she settled into position, again she slowed her breathing. Another shot cracked through the air and again, ping. The steel plate rang like a bell across the distance. 2 shots. 2 hits. At a range most men never dared attempt. The SEAL who had mocked her let out a strangled sound, half laugh, half groan, unable to reconcile what he had just witnessed. His arrogance drained out of him like water spilling from a cracked jug. The officer's voice finally broke the silence, low but carrying, the kind of tone that silenced all doubt. Do it again. It wasn't a command born of disbelief anymore but of hunger. Hunger to see if this was real, if lightning could strike 3 times. She obliged without a word, her movements smooth, economical, devoid of drama. Another shot. Another impossible hit. The steel plate rang a 3rd time, mocking the men who had missed it dozens of times before. By now the laughter was gone, replaced by something else entirely. Respect, awe, and a tinge of fear threaded through the ranks of men who had once scoffed at her presence. They had given her the rifle as a joke and in return she had shattered their certainties, rewritten what they thought possible. The officer stared at her, his mind already racing with questions he didn't voice. Who was she? How did she know? And most of all, what else was she capable of? The men didn't know how to react, their discipline fraying at the edges as they stared at her. Soldiers were trained to accept failure, to endure impossibility, but what they had just witnessed didn't fit inside the neat lines of their training. The bent reality. The officer stood longer than the rest, his boots planted firm, his eyes never leaving the woman who had just embarrassed his best shooters. The desert wind tugged at the edges of his cap as he finally spoke, his voice gravelly but steady. Where did you learn that? His question carried no mockery, no sarcasm, only the raw demand of a man who wanted to understand what had just unfolded before him. The woman lifted her cheek from the rifle, brushing a wisp of hair from her forehead, and finally met his gaze. Her eyes were calm, almost too calm, and she said nothing. The silence stretched. It wasn't the silence of defiance but the silence of someone who didn't see the need to explain themselves. The officer frowned, waiting, but she only blinked once, slowly, and returned her attention to the weapon. The SEAL who had mocked her the loudest broke the tension, his pride needing air. That was luck, he spat, his voice louder than it needed to be. He wanted the others to agree, to restore the fragile scaffolding of his ego. Nobody hits that distance 3 times in a row. Not without a spotter, not without charts, not without. He cut himself off, the edge of his words betraying his desperation. The officer didn't look at him. Instead, he raised a hand, silencing the murmurs bubbling through the group. His focus remained fixed on her. Stand down, he told his men. Then, after a pause, he nodded toward the rifle again. Show me again. On my mark. He gestured toward one of the range assistants, who scrambled to drag a fresh steel plate farther into the desert. Dust rose behind the small vehicle as it carried the target out, this time setting it down at a slightly greater distance, as though to stretch the limits of what they had already witnessed. The woman did not hesitate. She rose to her knees as the vehicle retreated, waiting until the dust settled and the desert returned to its quiet, shimmering heat. She lay back down behind the rifle, adjusted the scope, and closed her eyes for a moment, her face turning slightly to the wind. Her stillness unsettled the men. She wasn't measuring, wasn't calculating in ways they understood. There was no handheld weather gauge, no range card, no complex mathematics scribbled into a notebook. She simply breathed, attuned to something unseen. When she opened her eyes again, the officer gave the signal. She squeezed the trigger and once more the sound cracked through the air. They all leaned forward, straining against distance, waiting. Then, faint but unmistakable, the steel rang again. This time the silence afterward was heavier. Not even the arrogant SEAL spoke. No one could claim luck anymore. Once was chance, twice was improbable, 3 times a phenomenon, and now this was undeniable mastery. The officer's jaw worked, grinding as though trying to chew through disbelief. He stepped closer to her, lowering himself to one knee beside the mat, studying her face, her hands, her posture. She didn't look back at him. Her world had narrowed to the glass and steel before her, the rhythm of breath and trigger, the long silence between thunder and impact. Finally he spoke low, only for her to hear. "You're not just some villager, are you?" His words were not accusation, not quite suspicion, but a probing curiosity edged with caution. Still she didn't answer. Instead she fired again. Another ping. The steel sang its high, mocking note, carried faintly across the barren range. She reloaded with a motion so fluid it was as though the rifle belonged more to her than to them. The men began exchanging looks now, silent conversations written across their tense faces. The officer stood, straightening his spine, his decision written in the set of his shoulders. He turned to his men. "No one says a word about this outside the range. Do you understand me?" His voice cracked like a whip, and the silence that followed was obedience, reluctant but firm. They nodded, though unease rippled among them. Secrets among soldiers never stayed buried long, but his tone carried the weight of command, enough to stifle protest for now. He shifted back toward her, studying the way she packed the rifle down after her demonstration. Her movements still patient, unhurried, untouched by the tension building around her. The SEAL who had mocked her still couldn't accept it. Pride, once fractured, doesn't heal easily. "This is a trick," he barked, his voice raw as if trying to convince himself. "She's done this before. Maybe she's some insurgent plant, maybe?" He stopped when the officer's glare found him, a look that carried more weight than any shouted order. "That's enough," the officer said, his tone lethal in its calmness. "You're a soldier. Act like one." The man shut his mouth, his face flushing red, the heat of humiliation greater than the desert sun. She stood at last, dusting the grit from her knees, and for the first time she let her eyes sweep over the men around her. They expected triumph in her gaze, or maybe mockery returned to them in equal measure, but there was none of that. Her eyes were steady, almost sorrowful, as if she carried a burden that weighed heavier than the rifle itself. She looked at the officer last, then lowered her gaze, turning to walk away without a word. The men parted to let her through, not out of courtesy but out of something closer to reverence, or fear. The officer watched her leave, the silence of his men pressing around him. He knew what they were thinking because he was thinking it too. No civilian picked up a precision rifle and struck targets at impossible ranges without years of training, without a past carved in battle. She wasn't simple, not in the way she appeared. She was something else entirely. He turned to his men, his voice low. "Get her name," he ordered. One of the range assistants hurried after her, calling out, but she didn't respond. She kept walking, her figure shrinking against the desert horizon until the heat waves swallowed her whole. The officer remained staring long after she vanished, the weight of what he had seen gnawing at the edges of his certainty. In war, skill like that didn't appear out of nowhere. It was forged, earned, honed through fire. He felt the tremor of possibility crawling through his chest. Who was she? A ghost from another war? A secret left behind in some forgotten battlefield? He didn't know, but one thing settled into his mind with the finality of a stone sinking into deep water. She was more dangerous than anyone in that camp. And for reasons he couldn't yet explain, he found himself hoping, perhaps even fearing, that this was not the last time he would see her. The night after her departure, the camp was restless. The desert had its own rhythm after dark, winds whispering through empty spaces, coyotes howling somewhere far off. But inside the wire, it was the silence of men turning thoughts over and over, unable to sleep. Soldiers were trained to carry burdens, to compartmentalize, to lock things away. But what had happened that day on the range refused to be buried. In the barracks, whispers drifted like smoke. Some said she was a legend in disguise, a ghost sniper from a war no one admitted happened. Others swore she was just a lucky civilian, though the tremor in their voices betrayed disbelief. The officer didn't join the talk. He sat alone in his quarters, the dim light of a desk lamp carving hard shadows across his face, his hands folded over a notepad filled with numbers, calculations, and questions that didn't have answers. He had seen men at the top of their craft miss that target all day. He had seen her strike it as if it were painted on the back of her hand. And that haunted him. By morning, orders had come down from higher command, routine drills, another day of training, reports to file. But the officer's mind was elsewhere. As the men gathered at the range again, their rifles lined up, their voices subdued, he found himself scanning the horizon unconsciously. He told himself she wouldn't come back. People like that didn't wander into camps twice. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling she wasn't finished with them. His instincts, honed through years of deployments, battles and men bleeding out in his arms, told him this story wasn't over. Around midday the dust stirred on the northern path. Heads turned as a solitary figure approached, walking with the same quiet steps as before. It was her. No escort, no explanation, just the same simple clothes and unassuming presence. The men stiffened, some in disbelief, some in dread, but none dared laugh this time. The memory of steel plates ringing across impossible distances still weighed too heavily. The officer stepped forward to meet her, his boots crunching against the gravel. "You're back," he said, though it sounded more like an accusation than a greeting. She nodded once, her expression unreadable. "Why?" he pressed, but she didn't answer. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly toward the range, where the rifles gleamed under the sun. The officer hesitated. Every instinct told him this was no accident. She hadn't stumbled onto them. She had chosen this place, this moment. He studied her face, searching for clues, for cracks in the mask of calm. There were none. "Fine," he said at last, motioning toward the bench. "Let's see it again." His men shuffled uneasily, forming a loose half-circle as she approached the rifle. No one mocked, no one muttered. Their silence was taut, expectant, the silence of witnesses to something they couldn't explain but couldn't look away from. This time the officer pushed the limits further. He ordered the steel plate moved even farther back, nearly 3.5 kilometers, a range so absurd it bordered on impossible. The men exchanged uneasy glances, but none questioned the order. The range assistants worked quickly, the vehicle kicking up another cloud of dust as it dragged the heavy target out into the shimmering distance. When it was finally set and the air cleared, the officer turned back to her. "If you can hit that, I'll believe whatever story you want to tell me," he said. It was meant as a challenge, maybe even as a trap, but she only lowered herself to the mat with the same serenity as before. Her hands moved across the rifle with precision, checking, adjusting, steadying. The men leaned forward instinctively, as though drawn into the orbit of what was about to happen. She closed her eyes briefly, inhaled, then let the breath slip out in a slow stream. When her eyes opened again, they were hard, sharp, focused on something none of them could see. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, its echo rolling across the barren land like thunder. The bullet vanished into the shimmering heat. The men held their breath. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, faint and distant, the steel rang. A sound that shouldn't have been possible, not at that range, not with a single unaided shot. But it was there, undeniable, carrying across the desert like a ghost's whisper. The men erupted, some shouting disbelief, others swearing aloud, but none dared laugh anymore. They had crossed a line. This was no trick, no luck, no anomaly. This was skill beyond what their minds could reconcile. The officer didn't move, didn't speak. His eyes narrowed, his face tightening as though he had glimpsed something he wished he hadn't. He knew what it meant to hit at that range, what kind of calculations, what kind of instinct, what kind of experience it demanded. And she had done it with a calm that unsettled him more than the feat itself. She fired again. Ping. Again. Ping. 4 shots, 4 impossible hits, at a distance most of his best men would never even attempt. When she finally lowered the rifle, silence reigned. The officer stepped forward, his boots slow, deliberate. "Enough," he said, though the word sounded more like surrender than command. He crouched beside her again, lowering his voice. "Who taught you?" Still she didn't answer. Her gaze was steady, unwavering, meeting his now. There was no arrogance in her eyes, no triumph. Only the weight of something deeper, something unspoken. He felt a chill under the desert sun. She stood, brushing dust from her hands, and this time she didn't turn to leave. She stayed waiting. The officer realized she was testing him as much as he was testing her. His men looked to him, restless, their certainty shattered. They wanted him to explain, to give them something solid to cling to. But he had nothing. He only knew that this woman, this simple stranger, had just redrawn the boundaries of what they believed possible. That night, the whispers returned, heavier than before. Some of the men were convinced she had been a sniper once, trained by forces unknown. Others swore she was some kind of myth, a story come to life. In the barracks, one soldier muttered that maybe she wasn't even human, maybe she was something else entirely. The nervous laughter that followed didn't last long. The officer stayed silent through it all, staring out the narrow window of his quarters, the desert stretching endlessly into darkness. He knew better than to believe in myths. But he also knew what he had seen. And what he had seen terrified him. The following morning broke with a haze of dust rolling across the range, carried by winds that rattled the loose sheets of metal stacked near the outpost. The men were already assembled, but there was no usual chatter, no banter, none of the bravado that normally filled the empty spaces of waiting. They moved through their drills with a mechanical stiffness, their thoughts tethered to the memory of what they had seen. The woman had left again just before sunset, her figure swallowed by the desert horizon, but her presence lingered like a shadow none of them could shake. The officer paced at the edge of the range, his boots crunching in rhythm, his eyes distant. He wasn't just unsettled, he was calculating. Men like him didn't leave questions unanswered, not when those questions threatened to unravel the order of things. He found himself at the command tent, the glow of a monitor casting pale light on his lined face as he tapped through files. Records, intelligence reports, fragments of information gathered over years of operations in hostile lands. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, only that he couldn't accept the silence she carried with her. Someone somewhere must have known her. A face like that didn't appear without history. He searched for mentions of snipers, of long-range kills, of whispers carried by locals about a ghost who never missed. And though no official file named her, patterns began to emerge. Rumors of insurgents felled at impossible distances, stories told in hushed tones around village fires. Always a shadow at the center, never identified. His gut tightened. It fit too well to be coincidence. Meanwhile, the men tried to carry on. They cleaned their rifles, they ran their drills, they went through the motions of soldiers on duty. But their eyes betrayed them, flicking often to the horizon, half expecting her return. When they spoke to one another, their voices were lower now, as if afraid she might hear even from miles away. Respect had rooted itself where mockery once thrived. Fear too. They had seen her lay waste to their certainty, and in the world of soldiers, certainty was survival. To lose it was to step into chaos. By late afternoon, dust stirred again on the northern path. A figure emerged, the heat shimmering around her like a mirage. She walked the same as before, quiet, deliberate, unhurried. This time, however, she wasn't empty-handed. Slung across her shoulder was not their rifle but an older model, weathered, its wood darkened by years of use. The men straightened instinctively, unease running through their ranks. The officer narrowed his eyes as she approached, his body tense. She stepped onto the range, unslinging the rifle and laying it down as though she were placing an offering on an altar. The weapon was nothing like the sleek precision instruments the SEALs used. It was old, scarred, its scope scratched, its stock dented and worn. Yet the way she touched it carried reverence, as though this relic was more alive than any modern rifle they possessed. The officer crouched beside it, inspecting the weapon with a practiced eye. "Where did you get this?" he asked. She didn't answer, but her fingers brushed the stock, pausing over an etching so faint it was barely visible, letters worn down by time. He squinted, trying to make them out, but she pulled the rifle closer before he could. Without a word, she moved to the mat again, setting the rifle into position. The men exchanged uneasy glances. The officer stepped back, his voice hard. "Targets? 2,000 meters. Move." The assistant scrambled, hauling steel plates into position. The woman didn't watch them. She was already lying prone, cheek against the old stock, her breathing steady. When the targets were set, the officer gave a sharp nod. "On my mark." The desert went silent. She pulled the trigger, the crack of the old rifle less refined, deeper, carrying a raw edge. The bullet soared, and once again, seconds later, the steel rang. The men froze. She fired again, then again, each shot met with the same distant ping. The officer clenched his jaw. The rifle wasn't built for this. Not at that range, not with that consistency. Yet she wielded it as though physics itself bent to her command. By the fourth shot, something shifted. The officer wasn't just awed anymore, he was unsettled on a deeper level. The way she moved, the way she seemed to merge with the weapon, it wasn't training alone. It was instinct carved into bone, as though she had been born with this skill rather than taught it. He realized then that no file, no report, no intelligence document could ever capture what she was. She wasn't the product of a program. She wasn't a soldier shaped by someone else's hand. She was her own creation, forged in silence, carrying a story no one dared tell. The mocking seal, the one who had laughed the loudest before, finally broke under the weight of it. His voice cracked as he shouted, "What are you?" The question wasn't meant as insult anymore, it was raw fear dressed as words. She didn't look at him. She finished her final shot, the steel answering again, then slowly sat up. Her eyes swept over the group, steady, calm, and for the first time she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost carried away by the wind, but every man heard it. "I am no one," she said. 4 simple words, yet they struck deeper than any explanation. The officer's throat tightened. No one. It was a denial, a shield, and a truth all at once. He wanted to press, to demand more, but something in her eyes silenced him. They weren't the eyes of someone hiding, they were the eyes of someone who had already given too much. She stood, slinging the old rifle back over her shoulder. This time, when she turned to leave, no one moved to stop her. The men watched in silence as she walked toward the horizon, the heat waves swallowing her again. The officer remained still long after she was gone, the echo of her voice looping in his mind. I am no one. But he knew better. People like her didn't just exist in shadows without purpose. She was someone dangerous, someone extraordinary. And if she could do what she had just done with a relic of wood and steel, then she was more than a mystery. She was a problem. That night, the officer sat alone, staring at the etching he had glimpsed on the rifle's stock, trying to reconstruct the letters in his mind. He couldn't. But he knew what it meant. The rifle had a history and so did she. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of command pressing down harder than ever. He had a choice to make. He could bury this as he had ordered his men, pretend she had never existed. Or he could chase the truth, risk unraveling something far bigger than himself. When the lights flickered and the desert wind rattled the thin walls of his quarters, he made his decision. Tomorrow he would send word up the chain. This wasn't something he could hold onto alone anymore. The woman had shown them something impossible, and in the world of war, impossibility was the one thing that could never be ignored. By dawn, the officer's report was already drafted, though it had taken him most of the night to finish. The words came reluctantly, pulled from him like teeth, each sentence heavier than the last. He didn't describe her as she truly was. He couldn't, not without sounding insane, but he laid down the facts he knew. A civilian woman appeared on base, demonstrated unprecedented long-range marksmanship, struck targets at ranges exceeding 3,000 meters with consistency. He avoided speculation, avoided weaving myths into the record. But the truth between the lines was clear. This was no ordinary encounter. He sealed the report and sent it through secure channels, knowing command would read it with suspicion. Maybe they'd laugh, maybe they'd bury it. But a part of him hoped they wouldn't. Because as much as she unsettled him, he understood her existence carried consequences. And consequences never stayed buried long. The men sensed the shift the next morning. Orders were tighter, schedules more rigid, drills longer. The officer drove them hard, not because he wanted discipline but because he wanted distraction. Yet distraction was fragile. Their eyes still drifted toward the horizon, their silence still carried her weight. They couldn't scrub her from memory no matter how hard they tried. Even the arrogant SEAL had grown quieter, though his silence was more bitter than reverent, the silence of a man who had been broken in front of his brothers. When night fell, the camp settled into its uneasy routine, but the officer remained restless. He walked the perimeter under the stars, his boots crunching softly in the sand. The desert was vast and merciless, a place where secrets could vanish without a trace. And yet, he felt her out there, somewhere beyond the dark ridges, her presence like a thread pulling at his thoughts. He tried to shake it. He had led men through firefights, through ambushes, through blood and chaos. He wasn't easily haunted. But she haunted him. Not because of what she had done but because of what it meant. There were forces at play beyond his control. The next day brought the answer he had been waiting for, though not in the form he expected. A convoy rolled into camp by midday, dust trailing behind armored vehicles. At its head was a black SUV, the kind that didn't belong to military operations but to the shadowed corners of intelligence. Men in plain clothes stepped out, their movements sharp, their eyes harder than steel. They didn't introduce themselves but everyone knew what they were. Spooks, the kind who moved between wars, collecting secrets like hunters collected trophies. The officer greeted them stiffly, offering no salute. There were no ranks here, only authority carried in silence. Inside the command tent, the air grew heavy. They read his report, their eyes scanning quickly, their faces revealing nothing. Then they asked questions, too many questions. How tall was she? What language had she spoken, if any? Did she carry identification? Did she leave anything behind? The officer answered what he could, but it was never enough. Their silence after each response was worse than accusation. Finally, one of them leaned forward, his voice a low rasp. If she returns, you will detain her. The words dropped like stones into the room. The officer stiffened. She's not a threat, he said carefully, though even as he spoke, he questioned the truth of it. The man's eyes narrowed. Anyone who can do what you've described is always a threat. No debate followed. The message was clear. Orders had been given. When the spooks left, the camp was quieter than ever. The officer gathered his men, delivering new rules with a voice that carried no room for argument. If she comes back, we don't engage. We don't mock. We don't ask questions. We follow orders. Detain. That's it. His men looked at him with unease, their discomfort not with the command but with the thought of standing against her. None of them wanted to face the woman who had made them feel like children. But orders were orders. Days passed. She didn't come. The officer half hoped she never would. But hope had no place in war, and on the fourth evening as the sun bled into the horizon, dust stirred on the northern path again. A figure emerged. The same quiet steps, the same calm presence, but something was different now. She carried no rifle, no weapon at all. Only herself. The men tensed, their hands twitching toward rifles, their training screaming at them to prepare. The officer raised a hand, halting them. His chest tightened. This wasn't a drill anymore. This was the moment command had warned about. She walked into camp, her eyes scanning the assembled soldiers. There was no fear in her gaze, no hesitation. She stopped a few paces from the officer, meeting his eyes directly. For the first time, he saw something flicker in her expression. Not sorrow, not defiance, but exhaustion, the kind carried by someone who had lived too long in silence. He forced his voice steady. You'll need to come with us. It wasn't a request. The men shifted, uncertain. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. No resistance. No struggle. She followed as they led her into the command tent, the air inside thick with tension. The officer stood across from her, searching her face. Who are you? He asked again, though this time the question carried desperation. She looked at him, her eyes steady, and spoke the same words as before. I am no one. But this time she added something more. And that is why you should fear me. The words chilled the room. The officer's breath caught, his skin prickling. She wasn't bragging, wasn't threatening. She was warning. The silence stretched, heavier than before, until the officer finally spoke. Why come back? Why here? Her eyes flickered then, just for a second, toward the men outside, toward the rifles stacked neatly, toward the horizon where the war bled on endlessly. And though she didn't answer directly, the truth shimmered in the air like heat. She hadn't come for them. She had come for what was coming. The officer's throat tightened. He realized then that she wasn't just a mystery, she was a storm waiting to break. And the desert, unforgiving as it was, might not be wide enough to contain what would follow. The tent's canvas walls rustled faintly under the desert wind, but inside the air felt heavy, pressing down on every man in the room. The woman sat on a metal chair, her hands resting loosely in her lap, posture calm but unyielding. The officer paced slowly across from her, his boots grinding into the sand-dusted floor. His men lingered outside, tense shadows against the flickering lamplight, waiting for orders that never came. Intelligence had told him to detain her, to treat her as a potential threat, but now that she was here, silent, watchful, composed, he found himself hesitating. She wasn't resisting, wasn't dangerous in any obvious way. And yet, her presence carried a gravity that unsettled him more than if she'd walked in with a weapon raised. He leaned forward, planting his hands on the table between them. You've shown us what you can do, he said, his voice low, controlled. But I need to know why. Why here? Why now? Her eyes lifted to meet his, calm and unwavering. Because the world forgets what it doesn't understand, she said softly. Her accent was faint, hard to place, shaped by years of silence. And when it forgets, it repeats. The officer frowned, not fully grasping her meaning, but before he could press further, one of his men burst into the tent. Sir, movement on the ridgeline. Multiple contacts. Armed. The officer straightened instantly, every muscle in his body shifting into readiness. The woman didn't move, didn't even blink, but her eyes sharpened, narrowing as though she had been expecting this. The officer barked orders, his voice cutting through the camp. Positions. Get eyes on that ridge. Men scrambled to their posts, rifles snapping up, scopes adjusting, radios crackling with terse voices. Dust swirled in the fading light as tension surged through the camp like a live wire. Through binoculars, the officer counted shapes cresting the ridge. Dozens of them, armed insurgents moving with practiced precision. They weren't scouts. They weren't probing. This was an assault. His gut clenched. The camp wasn't prepared for a full-scale attack at dusk. The timing was too perfect, the kind of precision strike that suggested inside knowledge. His eyes flicked toward the woman in the tent. Had she drawn them here? Or had she known this was coming all along? Gunfire cracked, sharp and sudden, echoing across the desert. The ridge lit up with muzzle flashes, bullets whistling down toward the camp. Men ducked behind barriers, returning fire, shouting coordinates into radios. The officer grabbed his rifle, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Hold the line. Keep them off the wire." The camp erupted in controlled fury, the night alive with thunder and fire. Through it all, she remained seated in the tent, her posture unchanged, her eyes tracking the horizon. But then, with deliberate calm, she stood. She stepped past the officer, ignoring the chaos, and walked straight toward the open air of the battlefield. His hand shot out to stop her. "You're not going out there," he snapped. She paused, looked at him, and for the first time, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "This is why I came." Before he could argue, she was moving, striding into the storm of bullets and dust. The men who saw her shouted, some in panic, some in disbelief, but she didn't falter. She knelt beside one of the abandoned shooting benches, her movements unhurried even as rounds snapped past. She unslung the old rifle from her back, the weathered wood catching the last glint of sunlight, and set it down with reverence. The officer froze, caught between commanding her back and watching in awe as she lay prone, cheek against the worn stock, eyes narrowing through the scratched scope. The insurgents had distance on their side, using the ridge as cover, their fire disciplined, measured. But at nearly 2 kilometers they believed themselves safe, untouchable. They had chosen their ground well. What they hadn't counted on was her. She exhaled, squeezed the trigger, and the old rifle thundered. A figure on the ridge crumpled, his weapon slipping from his hands. Another shot, another fall. Her cadence was steady, her rhythm unbroken, each crack of the rifle followed by the faint, delayed thud of a body hitting dust. The men in the camp faltered in their own firing, staring at her in disbelief. She wasn't suppressing. She was cutting them down, one after another, with surgical precision. The officer snapped himself out of it, barking at his men. "Hold your fire. Let her work." They obeyed without hesitation, not out of discipline but because they knew instinctively that she was rewriting the battle before their eyes. The ridge erupted in panic. The insurgents shifted, scrambling for cover, their momentum shattered. They had expected to overwhelm a camp of soldiers, not to face a ghost with an impossible rifle. Shot after shot rang out, each one a death knell. Her calm never broke, her breathing steady, her eyes unblinking. The officer found himself watching not the ridge, not his men, but her. This woman who had walked into his camp a mystery and was now turning the tide of a battle single-handedly. Her words from before echoed in his mind, "I am no one. And that is why you should fear me." He understood now. She was a shadow, unclaimed by any flag, untethered to any command, carrying nothing but her skill. And that made her unstoppable. Within minutes, the ridge fell silent. The surviving insurgents broke, fleeing into the dark, their attack shattered, their numbers bleeding into the desert night. The camp held its breath, the gunfire fading into an eerie stillness. The officer raised his binoculars, scanning the ridge. Bodies lay sprawled in the dust, weapons abandoned, their formation destroyed. The battle was over before it had truly begun. She rose slowly, sliding the old rifle back over her shoulder. Her face was calm, her movements measured, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. The men stared at her with wide eyes, their disbelief turning into something deeper. Reverence, fear, gratitude tangled together in silence. No one spoke. No one dared. The officer stepped forward, his boots heavy in the quiet. He stopped beside her, studying her face in the fading light. "You knew," he said, his voice quiet but certain. She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. "Yes." The single word landed like a stone in his chest. She hadn't stumbled into them. She hadn't come by chance. She had known the attack was coming, known where and when, and chosen to stand with them. He exhaled slowly, the weight of realization pressing down. "Then tell me who you are." His words carried no command now, only need. She looked at him, her gaze steady, and for a moment he thought she might answer. But then she turned, her figure outlined against the dark horizon, and said nothing. She began to walk away again, her steps deliberate, her silence louder than any explanation. The officer let her go this time, his men watching with the same haunted awe. The desert swallowed her once more, leaving behind only the bodies on the ridge and the echo of shots that would never be forgotten. And though she had saved them, though she had turned the tide of battle, unease twisted in his gut. Because if she could do this for them, she could just as easily do it against them. And that thought kept him awake long into the night. The next morning came quietly, though the camp itself was far from calm. The men who had survived the night before moved with a restless energy, whispering to one another in hushed tones, eyes darting toward the horizon as though half expecting the woman to reappear at any moment. Some swore she had been a spirit, a phantom summoned by the desert itself to save them. Others argued she was flesh and blood, but something more than human, a force honed by a lifetime that none of them could begin to understand. Whatever the truth, her absence was felt like a hollow weight, heavier than the battle they had endured. The officer hadn't slept. He sat at the edge of his cot, boots still on, rifle propped against his knee. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, the way she had walked into the storm without hesitation, the calm with which she had sighted down her rifle, the impossible precision that had turned the ridge into a graveyard. He wasn't easily shaken. Years in uniform had hardened him against fear and doubt. But she unsettled him in a way no enemy ever had. She didn't just defy logic, she defied definition. And that left him with questions no amount of tactical debriefs could answer. At dawn, a transport helicopter arrived, blades roaring against the pale desert sky. Dust whipped across the camp as higher command disembarked. 2 senior officers in crisp uniforms, their expressions already tight with suspicion. They had been briefed about the attack, about the miraculous defense, and most importantly, about her. The officer knew the questions that were coming. He straightened his uniform, pushed back the exhaustion, and prepared to stand his ground. The debrief took place in the command tent, maps pinned to the walls, radios humming faintly in the background. The senior officers pressed him hard, their words sharp. "You're telling us one untrained civilian broke an enemy assault at 2 kilometers with a relic of a rifle?" One demanded, his tone dripping with disbelief. "Do you hear yourself?" The officer kept his voice level. "I saw it with my own eyes. My men saw it. The ridge is littered with bodies to prove it." Another leaned in, narrowing his gaze. "Then where is she now? Why didn't you detain her?" The officer hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Because she doesn't belong to us. She came, she fought, and she left. Trying to hold her would have been like trying to hold the desert wind." The senior officers exchanged skeptical looks, their suspicion sharpening. To them, everything had to fit into categories: ally, enemy, asset, liability. But she defied those boxes, and that made her dangerous in their eyes. "If she shows herself again," one of them said firmly, "you will detain her." "That's not a request. We need to know what she is, and who she's working for." The officer nodded stiffly, but inside, his gut twisted. Detain her? Chain her like a criminal? He wasn't sure it was even possible. More than that, he wasn't sure it was wise. But orders were orders, and in the military, doubt was a luxury that could cost lives.